It was just past dawn on a bitterly cold Tuesday when Officer Mark Leland steered his squad car down Maple Avenue, barely noticing the snow swirling like white dust around the hood of his vehicle. For 20 years, he'd patrolled these streets, his days blurring into a routine of petty thefts, noise complaints, and traffic stops. But today, he felt especially hollow, as if the silence in his cruiser were echoing the emptiness in his chest. 3 months ago, he'd lost his wife, Nancy, to a sudden stroke, and since then the smallest sounds, a child laughing, a kettle whistling, felt like cruel reminders of the life he'd once had. Now he worked overtime shifts to keep from going home, filling his hours with paperwork and patrols to escape the shadows waiting for him in the quiet rooms of his house. His colleagues tried to help, bringing him coffee or offering awkward condolences, but no words could soften the ache that pulsed in his ribs every morning when he woke alone. He glanced at the photo clipped to his dashboard, a snapshot of him and Nancy at a lakeside picnic, and felt a tightness in his throat that made breathing suddenly difficult. That's when he caught a blur of movement in the road ahead. He slammed on the brakes, the cruiser fishtailing slightly, as a small orange tabby cat darted into his path and froze, its tail puffed up like a bottle brush. Mark's heart thudded in his chest as he stared into the cat's wide amber eyes, not yet understanding why it refused to move. Then he saw something clamped tightly in the animal's mouth, and everything else around him seemed to vanish. You won't believe how this story ends. It will touch even those with the hardest hearts and reveal a secret no one saw coming. At first, Mark thought the cat was simply frightened, stunned by the lights of his squad car glinting off the fresh snow like shards of glass. But then he realized the animal wasn't backing away, nor was it running off into the shadows. Instead, the tabby planted its paws firmly in front of the bumper, meowing frantically around whatever it held between its small, sharp teeth, as though determined to keep him there. Mark leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, and saw a hint of red dangling from the cat's jaws, swinging slightly as the cat shook its head from side to side. A sick fear coiled in his stomach as he cracked open the driver's door and stepped cautiously into the icy street, the crunch of snow under his boots sounding impossibly loud in the empty dawn. For a split second, he wondered if he was hallucinating, if grief and exhaustion had finally blurred the edges of reality. But the cat let out another high-pitched wail, and that shrill, desperate sound sliced right through his disbelief. His breath fogged the air as he inched closer, heart pounding like a hammer. He could see the cat's ribs beneath its thin coat, the animal so scrawny it looked like it might collapse any second. And then he saw that the red shape in the cat's mouth was moving. Mark crouched low, extending his gloved hand, unsure whether the cat would bolt or attack him in panic. The tabby took a hesitant step forward, eyes locked on his face, trembling as snowflakes gathered on its fur like tiny pearls. For a moment, time seemed suspended between them, as though the freezing world held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Mark whispered softly, trying to coax the animal closer, feeling the old habits of compassion from years on the force bubbling up despite the stone weight in his chest. The cat hesitated, then let out a pitiful croaking cry, sounding almost human in its desperation. Slowly it lowered its head and dropped the red, squirming bundle at his boots before staggering backward, its sides heaving. Mark's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Nestled in the snow, mewling weakly, was a newborn kitten, its umbilical cord still glistening and trailing across the icy ground. His breath caught in his throat as he realized the mother cat had carried her baby into the street for a reason, and he couldn't yet guess what that reason was. For several seconds, Mark could do nothing but stare, stunned by the tiny creature gasping in the snow, its fragile body shivering violently against the wind. The mother cat hovered a few feet away, pacing in tight, anxious circles, shooting frantic looks at her kitten and then back at Mark, as though begging him to do something, anything, to save her child. A wave of instinct surged through him, washing away his paralysis, and he scooped up the newborn, cradling it in his gloved hands, feeling the kitten's minuscule heartbeat fluttering like a trapped bird. Warmth and fear tangled inside him, crashing against the cold emptiness he'd carried for so long. His training as a cop couldn't help him now. This was delicate. This was life or death, and it was so heartbreakingly small. He glanced at the mother cat, who now sat perfectly still, eyes glistening with trust or perhaps sheer desperation. Somewhere deep in his chest, a spark of purpose flickered. surprising him with its sudden heat. He found himself murmuring reassurances, promising a creature who couldn't possibly understand that he wouldn't let it die. And yet, even as he held the kitten close, he felt certain there was more to this than a stray cat giving birth alone in the snow. Mark quickly scanned the area, his senses on high alert, suspecting there might be other kittens hidden nearby or some unseen danger lurking in the shadows. The mother cat darted past his boots, meowing frantically and glancing back at him as if urging him to follow. She disappeared beneath an abandoned car, her orange tail flicking urgently, while Mark hesitated, torn between calling for backup or plunging into the darkness after her. He could feel the snow soaking into the knees of his uniform as he crouched lower, straining his eyes to see beneath the rusted chassis. A gust of wind howled through the narrow street, carrying with it the faintest echo of another kitten's cry, thin, distant, almost lost in the storm. His pulse quickened as he realized that Tabby wasn't just trying to save one kitten, there might be an entire litter in danger. For a man who'd spent months feeling numb, the surge of adrenaline and protectiveness was almost dizzying. He knew in that instant that this was no ordinary call. Whatever lay hidden beneath that car might change everything he thought he knew about loss and about how to heal. And in the frozen silence that followed, Mark felt the first faint spark of something he hadn't dared hope for in months, a reason to keep fighting, to keep breathing, as he took a deep breath and crawled under the car, determined to discover the secret that the stray cat was trying so desperately to reveal. Mark slid on his belly beneath the abandoned car, the freezing slush seeping through his uniform, chilling him to the bone as tiny flakes of rust rained onto his shoulders. He could barely see in the dim shadows, but the mother cat kept meowing urgently, her cries bouncing off the cold metal. His flashlight beam quivered as he swept it across the narrow space, revealing patches of ice and dirt, and suddenly he froze, breath catching in his throat. Huddled against the far wheel well, half buried in a nest of oily rags, were two more newborn kittens, both slick with birth fluids and barely moving. Their tiny sides rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths, pink mouths opening in silent pleas. A sudden wave of panic surged through Mark because one of the kittens wasn't moving at all, its fur stiffening as ice crystals formed along its spine. The mother cat crawled toward her babies, nudging them with her nose, trying to rouse the limp one, her entire body trembling with desperation. Mark felt something raw and primal twist inside him, an instinctive urge to save the fragile little lives huddled before him. He reached out a trembling hand, the icy air burning his skin even through the glove, and touched the cold kitten gently, praying for any sign of warmth. Outside, the snow fell harder, shrouding the street in a white veil that muffled all sounds except the mother cat's ragged cries, which were now edged with panic. Mark carefully scooped up the two kittens, feeling their skin paper-thin and their bones fragile as glass beneath his fingertips, terrified that his rough hands might hurt them. The mother cat tried to climb onto his arm, her claws digging into his sleeve, as if to anchor herself to the only hope she could find. Mark's mind was spinning with questions he couldn't answer. How long had these kittens been out here? Where was the rest of the litter? Why would the mother risk carrying one kitten into the road while leaving the others hidden? He could see the mother cat's eyes, wide and pleading, as though she somehow knew her kittens would die without help. His training as a cop taught him to assess threats, to stay detached, but this felt different, far more urgent and personal than any domestic dispute or robbery call he'd ever handled. The cold wasn't just biting at his skin, it was sinking into his soul. He realized that every second he hesitated was a second closer to losing these tiny lives. And deep down, he feared that saving them might rip open wounds he'd tried so hard to close since Nancy died. He crawled back out from under the car, cradling all three kittens against his chest, the newborns mewling softly as they tried to find warmth. Snow swirled around him like confetti, settling into his hair and lashes, while the mother cat trotted at his heels, never taking her eyes off the fragile bundles in his arms. Mark placed the kittens gently on the passenger seat of his cruiser, turning up the heat to full blast, praying the warmth would keep their tiny hearts beating. He grabbed a spare fleece from the trunk and wrapped it around them, his hands trembling as he tucked it in around their quivering bodies. The mother cat jumped onto the passenger seat, curling her thin frame around her babies, pressing them close to her belly. A pang of awe struck Mark as he watched her mothering them, even in her own exhaustion and cold. but he knew they needed a vet immediately, and there was no time to wait for animal control. His police radio crackled to life with a call about a burglary, but he reached over and silenced it without a second thought. He couldn't walk away. Not this time. Mark slammed the cruiser door shut and slid behind the wheel, his breath coming hard as he stared through the windshield, trying to steady his shaking hands. He knew the risks of what he was about to do. Technically, transporting animals in a squad car violated department policy unless it was a K9 unit, and he'd be open to disciplinary action for abandoning a call. But looking at the kittens' tiny faces, eyes still sealed shut, and the mother cat's anxious gaze, he knew there was no other choice. The flashing reds and blues reflected off the snow, turning the world outside into a blur of light and shadows. But inside the cruiser, it was silent except for the faint cries of newborns. He thought of Nancy again, of how fiercely she'd loved every stray animal they'd ever found, and felt her presence as if she were urging him forward. His heart thundered in his chest as he shifted into drive. He whispered, "Hang on, little guys," and floored the accelerator, the cruiser fishtailing as he tore away from the curb. He didn't know if he could save them, but he had to try, because for the first time in months, he felt alive again. The mother cat, perched on the seat beside him, kept one paw on the fleece as if to keep her kittens safe, her eyes darting anxiously between her babies and the road ahead. Mark kept glancing over, both terrified and amazed at how she seemed to trust him completely, even though they'd met only minutes ago. He remembered countless nights he and Nancy had rescued animals, injured birds, stray dogs, even a squirrel once, and how she'd always believed each creature was a soul worth saving. The memory stabbed him with bittersweet pain, but also lit a fire in him he'd thought was long extinguished. As he sped through red lights, he radioed dispatch, his voice tight with urgency, requesting an emergency override so he could reach the nearest animal hospital. Static crackled back, and a voice barked at him to explain himself, but he ignored it, focusing on the mother cat's trembling form. Snow lashed against the windshield, reducing visibility to almost nothing, but he refused to slow down, because in his chest, something told him that saving these kittens might save him too. And as Mark raced toward the clinic, sirens wailing through the storm, he felt like he was balancing on a knife's edge between duty and compassion. The flashing lights painted the mother cat's orange fur in streaks of red and blue, transforming her into a vivid, living symbol of resilience and hope. Every pothole jarred the cruiser, and Mark kept one hand protectively on the carrier seat, ensuring the kittens didn't slide off. He felt an emotion rising in him so fierce it threatened to choke him, a mixture of fear, tenderness, and a desperate longing to believe he could still do some good in the world. His chest ached from holding his breath as the hospital came into view, glowing like a beacon through the swirling snow. In that moment, Mark made a silent vow. He wouldn't lose these tiny lives, not after everything he and Nancy had lost. He knew there would be consequences for his choices, but he also knew that he'd finally found something worth risking everything for. And as the mother cat pressed closer to her kittens, Mark realized he wasn't just rescuing them, he was rescuing a part of himself he'd thought was gone forever. Mark burst through the glass doors of the Lakeview Animal Hospital, snow swirling in behind him like a ghostly veil as he cradled the 3 kittens close to his chest. The fluorescent lights burned bright overhead, casting harsh reflections on the linoleum floor that smelled faintly of antiseptic and wet fur. A young vet tech looked up from the front desk, eyes widening as she saw the police officer panting, frost clinging to his uniform, and a frantic orange tabby perched on his shoulder. "Please," Mark gasped, voice breaking as he gently lowered the fleece-wrapped bundle onto the counter. "They're newborns. They're freezing. One's not moving." The tech's training kicked in instantly. She whisked the kittens away toward the back, shouting orders to colleagues as she disappeared through swinging doors. The mother cat hissed in alarm and tried to leap after them, but Mark caught her gently, whispering soft words as he held her trembling body. He felt the weight of every choice he'd made crashing over him, but he also felt something else, a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd done the right thing. For the first time in ages, he realized his heart was pounding for a reason other than grief. Behind the treatment room door, Mark could hear muffled voices and the beeping of medical machines, a stark reminder that tiny lives hung by a thread just a few feet away. The mother cat twisted anxiously in his arms, her claws flexing and retracting as though she were torn between fleeing and fighting to get to her babies. Mark lowered himself onto a plastic chair, exhaustion overtaking him as adrenaline bled out of his system, leaving his limbs heavy and trembling. A nurse approached with a gentle smile, offering a towel to wrap around the mother cat, who was shivering uncontrollably despite the warm clinic air. Mark took the towel, carefully enveloping the cat, murmuring softly as her frantic breathing slowed, her ears flicking at the distant sounds of the kitten's cries. A memory flashed through Mark's mind of Nancy, holding an injured puppy wrapped in a towel just like this, her face glowing with determination and love. He blinked hard against the sting of tears. He wanted to believe Nancy would have been proud of him for choosing compassion over protocol, and as he sat there holding this trembling cat, he wondered if he'd finally found a purpose he thought he'd lost forever. After what felt like an eternity, a veterinarian in green scrubs pushed through the door, wiping her hands on a cloth and giving Mark a quick, searching look. "Officer Leland?" she asked gently. Mark shot to his feet, his breath catching as he studied her face for any clue to the kitten's fate. The vet nodded, a small relieved smile tugging at her lips. "Two are doing okay. The third was hypothermic, but we've got him warmed up and breathing on his own. You got them here just in time." Mark sagged against the counter, a rush of relief so fierce it made his vision blur. The mother cat let out a soft, plaintive meow, and the vet leaned forward, extending a hand for her to sniff. "You saved them," the vet said, voice thick with genuine emotion. She knew she couldn't do it alone. That's why she brought one into the street to find help. Mark stared at her, stunned by the realization that the cat had risked everything, braving the road, choosing him of all people. And for a moment, the weight of his own loss seemed to lighten, as though he'd been granted a tiny miracle in the midst of his grief. Word of the rescue spread quickly through the hospital, and soon other staff members drifted in to see the kittens, each touched by the story of a cop who'd risked his job to save a stray cat and her newborns. One nurse offered to call the department to explain Mark's absence from his shift, while another handed him a styrofoam cup of coffee that steamed like a small beacon of comfort in his chilled hands. The vet encouraged him to stay until the kittens were stable, promising they'd help arrange fosters or a shelter placement if needed. Mark hesitated, glancing at the mother cat, who now sat quietly beside him on the counter, eyes half closed, as though sensing that her babies were safe at last. It struck him how in the span of a single morning, he'd gone from a man drowning in sorrow to someone who'd made a tangible difference. He could almost hear Nancy's voice in his head, gentle and teasing. "See? The world still needs you." The realization brought a sudden, unexpected swell of pride. He knew he wasn't healed, not by a long shot, but for the first time in months, he felt a path forward, however uncertain it might be. Mark finally stepped into the treatment room, where the kittens lay curled on a heated pad beneath warm lights, their tiny bodies rising and falling with steady breaths. The mother cat leapt from his arms and rushed to her babies, licking their heads and rearranging them into a protective pile. Mark watched, mesmerized by her tenderness and resilience, his chest tightening with a mixture of grief and wonder. The vet joined him at the table, explaining that the kittens would need round-the-clock care for the next few weeks. She added with a small, knowing smile that the mother cat would do better in a calm environment, and that sometimes the best place for animals to heal was in a real home rather than a shelter. Mark stared down at the mother cat, who paused mid-lick to look up at him, her amber eyes shining with a trust so profound it made his throat ache. In that quiet moment, surrounded by soft mews and the faint hum of medical machines, Mark realized that his life might still hold room for new beginnings. And though he wasn't sure he was ready, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He couldn't walk away from them now. 2 weeks later, sunlight streamed through the windows of Mark's modest living room, casting golden squares across the hardwood floor, where the mother cat, whom he'd begun calling Ember, lounged in a patch of warmth, purring softly. The three kittens, now stronger and rounder, tumbled over each other in a chaotic ball of fur, their tiny claws scraping against the rug as they chased each other's tails. Mark sat cross-legged on the floor, still in his uniform trousers but without his patrol shirt, laughing as one brave kitten attempted to scale his knee, mewing triumphantly when it reached his thigh. The house felt different now, not just physically fuller with food bowls and litter boxes, but alive in a way it hadn't felt since Nancy's laughter used to echo off the walls. It smelled faintly of kitten formula and fresh coffee, a scent that somehow felt like hope. Even the framed photos of Nancy seemed to glow more warmly, as though silently approving of the new life unfolding here. Neighbors had started dropping by with supplies, blankets, toys, bags of cat food, as word of Mark's rescue spread through the community. And though grief still clung to him in quiet moments, there were now long stretches of peace when he could simply breathe without pain. He found himself talking to Ember late at night, telling her secrets he hadn't shared with anyone since Nancy died. And in those moments it felt as though some invisible bridge had formed between his fractured past and an unexpected, gentler future. Mark soon became something of a local hero, his story circulating in newspapers and even making a brief segment on the evening news, complete with footage of Ember and her kittens tumbling around his living room. Strangers sent letters and donations to the animal hospital, moved by the tale of the lonely cop who'd risked his badge to save a cat and her babies. His fellow officers, once skeptical about his sudden disappearance that snowy morning, began stopping by the house to see the kittens, gruffly pretending it was just curiosity, though many left smiling and visibly softened. Mark had never thought he'd welcome so many people into his home again, but now laughter and conversation filled the rooms that had once been silent and cold. The police chief himself pulled Mark aside one afternoon to tell him that, while technically his actions had broken protocol, sometimes saving lives is more important than following the book. It was the first time Mark had felt genuine pride in his badge since Nancy died. He realized he wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. And the kittens, oblivious to the weight of the world, continued to explore every corner of his house, transforming grief into small, joyful moments. Ember, though still skittish around loud noises, settled into her new life with cautious trust, often perching on the back of Mark's sofa to watch him with luminous amber eyes. At night, she curled beside him on the couch, pressing close as though to anchor them both against the darkness. Mark marveled at how much this fragile creature had endured, surviving the cold, risking her life for her babies, and then choosing to trust a human again. It reminded him painfully of how Nancy had always believed in second chances, in rescuing anything or anyone who needed saving. Mark caught himself whispering apologies to Ember for all the times he'd driven past stray animals in the past, too numb to care. But Ember seemed to forgive him easily, resting her chin on his arm and purring as if to say that the past could stay where it was. Some nights, as he watched the kittens nurse or play, Mark felt the shadows of his grief lift slightly, replaced by a new and delicate purpose. He even dug out his camera, dusty from years of disuse, and began photographing Ember and her babies, sending the images to the hospital to help find them loving homes. Each picture felt like a step closer to reclaiming the man he used to be. And though the ache of loss would never vanish completely, Mark was learning that love could still grow in the cracks left behind. Soon, the community rallied around Mark and Ember's story, organizing a fundraiser for the animal hospital and starting a program called Ember's Second Chance, dedicated to rescuing stray animals during harsh winters. Mark found himself speaking at events, his voice trembling as he described that freezing morning and how a tiny orange cat had forced him to care again. Local businesses donated blankets, food, and heaters for outdoor cat colonies, while volunteers signed up in record numbers to foster animals through the coldest months. Mark was astonished by how many people admitted they too were carrying hidden griefs or silent struggles, and how Ember's story had cracked something open inside them. He realized that one cat's desperate plea for help had transformed into a ripple of compassion spreading through their town. And though he still missed Nancy with every breath, he could feel her presence in the good he was now able to do. Ember, once a starving stray, had become a symbol of resilience and hope for an entire community. Mark understood, in a way he hadn't before, that sometimes saving a life meant saving your own in the process. And as he stood beneath the fundraiser banner, surrounded by neighbors and friends, he felt the warmth of belonging again. On a quiet Sunday evening, Mark sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in streaks of rose and gold. Ember curled against his side while the kittens dozed in a basket nearby. A breeze carried the faint sound of children laughing down the street, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the sound didn't make him flinch. He traced gentle circles on Ember's fur, thinking of how close he'd come to giving up on ever feeling anything but pain. The memory of that freezing morning was etched into his mind, the cat standing defiantly in the snow, a tiny red bundle dangling from her mouth, and he knew he'd never forget how she'd looked at him with such fierce trust. Ember shifted closer, purring deep and low, as if sensing his thoughts. Mark tilted his head back, breathing in the summer air, feeling the hard knots of grief slowly loosening inside his chest. The world was still imperfect, still full of loss and pain, but for the first time in months, he felt strong enough to face it. And he knew that while Nancy's chapter in his life would never close, this new chapter, written alongside Ember and her kittens, was worth living. As twilight deepened, Mark whispered into the fading light, "Thank you for saving me." And deep in his heart, he finally believed he might be okay. He didn't just save a cat, he found himself.